God only knows what's down here.
What the hell?
It'll be
Oh, Jesus Christ! Son of a...
Capcom are on a roll and bringing back them 90s feels. Not only with the Devil May Cry titles that I've already covered, but now one of the greatest horror games ever made. The pre-millennium feels continue with a demo. Just as we got with the Resident Evil Director's Cut and its packed-in demo, we now get a 30-minute slice of the remake. Yes, this is a remake, plain and simple. And an incredible one at that. Now, before I get into the full game, which releases on the 25th of January, I wanted to hit the facts across all versions which saw a demo released yesterday. Here I look at the PC, the premium consoles and those base models in a demo head-to-head. Now be careful, this could get messy.
Shit!
The first thing is, the remake is an absolute work of art. I will cover it in much more detail, but visually it looks absolutely gorgeous. Silky smooth, super detailed and super gory and gruesome. Exactly what these titles need to deliver. This isn't for the squeamish, so if you don't like horror and gore, this isn't the game to play, and certainly don't watch the rest of this video, because there are some points in this which you may turn your stomach ever so slightly. You can dismember enemies, shoot their arms, legs off, and they react to that. Shoot their leg off and they'll come at you and start dragging their severed limbs at you trying to attack. You can shoot their hands off, shoot their heads, everything comes apart procedurally and just breaks and destructs. Shoot holes through them, blow their heads off, and they are tough. You can blow them apart and they still keep a-coming, which makes for a great and scary title, which is backed up by beautiful use of lighting, shadows and the sound effects which make you twist around and look around the room. If you can, play this game with headphones or with a surround sound system in place, because it sounds impeccable and really makes you react to things. It is a shame that we don't see a VR mode here like we saw in 7, but this is a much faster paced title, so it may raise that sickness level significantly, and they are certainly pushing the visual quality way above what we saw in Resident Evil 7. But as I say, I'll cover that more in a full analysis of the final game. First up, resolution, and here on PC it's obviously dependent on your cache supply, but 4K native resolutions are possible with a collection of options that I will cover in depth in a future video. For now, we have a choice here to max the settings on my Ryzen 2700 and RTX 2070 GPU at 4K with a 60 FPS target. The main benefits here over the console stem from increased resolutions, screen space reflections, volumetrics and textures all benefit here with the extra GPU headroom afforded. The option to adjust TAA, FX, AA or off along with film grain, which can also be disabled on consoles, helps sharpen what is by nature a soft image. This sits well inside the RE engine style and material system we saw in Resident Evil 7. Currently though, this is likely the E3 build, and as such I would suspect not as tightly optimised as the final release, with it being a good 6 months plus old or more I would think, but a stable vertical slice for this demo here. Ray traced reflections will be an option in the final release, but not here in this demo. I will cover those in a separate video as they are very exclusive to just the RTX owners for now. The majority of PC players will use SSR just like console does. Quickly comparing it on my other PC, my much lower end FX 8350 and GTX 750 Ti, we obviously see huge sacrifices, dropping the resolution scaling down to 70% of 1080p and also using interlacing and other tweaks to drop the resolution and the quality down. You've got to sit below that 2GB of RAM. This game is very VRAM hungry, and obviously things like shadow cache will increase that, along with textures, screen space reflections and other effects that just add to the buffer sizes. Here though, it struggles to hold 60 FPS, but I'll cover that in more detail in the full analysis. It's still a great looking title and can run up to 60 FPS if we play around with the settings, but with a limited demo here, there's not a lot I can do with testing this out, so I'm trying the best I can in the short 30 minutes that are available. This is shared between the two PCs at this point. It does run well and look good, but again, expectations must be lower than what you see on the premium consoles and even the PS4. It certainly doesn't even look as good as the Xbox One at this point, which I'll cover in a moment. One other point to be aware of as well is the game does support DX12 obviously for the DXR ray tracing applications, but also DX11, but right now the performance is much worse and inconsistent on DX12. I'll cover that in the performance analysis on PC, and you'll see how different it can be between the two versions, even running on the exact same hardware. One final note, as you may have noticed, is the tone mapping or the colour space between the versions does seem slightly different on the GTX. So I'll be covering that in more depth, again limited by the demo here, but the consoles and the PC do seem to have a slightly different colour space, and then getting into the HDR setting on the game does require quite a few tweaks and changes due to the very strong black and contrast of whites in the game, both ends of the spectrum. So this really should be a strong HDR title, but right now the results are a little inconsistent that I need to play around with the settings to try and work out what works best. I will have a separate video on the HDR options, so don't panic about that just yet. Next up, we have the premium consoles in the X and the Pro. They share identical visual quality with shadow resolution, cascade distances, volumetrics, SSR, textures, right down to an identical resolution of 2880 by 1620 on both. This leaves a clean but soft image that suffers less from specular aliasing than the E3 demo, but that could be the footage quality then rather than any change to the engine. One addition is the X does look to be running FXAA, or at least a slightly stronger TAA than the Pro, which does reduce the aliasing on the edges over the Pro. The other possibility is the X is actually running native 1620 here, with the Pro using a checkerboard solution or that interlaced option to get to these points. Now this can be seen in the post effects such as the DOF backdrops here, which have that telltale stretched fringe look over the X. We have seen this many times before, and I've covered in detail such as my Horizon Zero Dawn analysis. As the game natively has a reconstruction element that they refer to as interlaced in the PC menu, I picked this up in my Res demo when this was not really a known thing, and I think I was alone in spotting that. Now this has continued here, and maybe the method they are using again here on the Pro, which also was used on 7 as I covered in my analysis. If you look at the edge of Leon's face when he moves, you can see breakup and jaggies on the side of his face, which you don't see on the X, and that's due to the reconstruction element, I'm pretty sure, but the additional TAA or FXAA, which is softening the image ever so slightly. But there's not a great deal in it, but I am leaning towards the fact that the X is native and the Pro is reconstructed. Now this interlace mode is also used on the Xbox One S, which delivers a final 1920 by 1080p image as it does on the PS4, but we seem to see the opposite of what we've just covered, with the PS4 running natively at 1920 by 1080 as it did in 7, and the X using that interlace reconstruction method to bring it back up to 1920 by 1080. It's obviously more obvious on the X over the PS4 that the image is being reconstructed, or at least there's some breakup on there. But it does render natively when you count it at 1080p. And unless you're analysing at this level, it still delivers a sharp and clean image overall. This does leave the game with a slightly softer and more jagged image on the Xbox One over the PS4 and certainly over the premium consoles, but those reconstruction elements, they can't really be picked up on the PS4, so again, like 7, if they are using it, I couldn't really spot it. Now, as this is a demo, I'm not going to spend an age analysing this, but the result is the PS4 does look slightly cleaner and sharper than the Xbox, but the overall presentation and image quality is very close across all, aside the increased resolution. 1080p players need not worry about it on these base consoles, but if you've got a 4K screen, they're best suited to premium consoles or the PC at this point. What about performance? Well, as I alluded to in my tweet yesterday, all versions target 60 FPS, but the results here vary widely, with the base console being some way off a locked level and almost pointless on the Xbox One. Briefly covering my lower end 750 Ti PC here, you can see that CPU usage is actually quite strong, which is quite in contrast to what we see on the Ryzen CPU, just by the IPC difference there. But it's GPU bound most of the time, and it struggles to hit 60 very often and drops right down into the 30s and sometimes below that in some of these sections. This is using DX11. It certainly needs some tweaks, and this is a very brief look, so I'm not saying this is where we are, but this is 70% scaling, and with interlace on, you gain around 3 or 4 FPS, not a huge amount, but it's certainly still a good looking title and performs smoothly. I'm sure with some tweaking we can get much closer still. This is an early release, remember. Flipping over to the new version here on the RTX 2070, no ray trace reflections at this point, maxing everything out at a native 4K, we can see quite a big difference. You can see here comparing it against the Pro, it's not really performing at that level here using DX12. I'll touch on that in a moment. So compared to the Pro, remember this is using much higher settings and a higher resolution. This is native 4K on the RTX 2070 here. At DX12, it doesn't run very well at all. It stutters and judders and it can skip way below that 30 FPS level. There's lots of judders. You can see the frame time is completely inconsistent and it feels very bad to play. And it crashed a lot. I struggled to get it to run quite a few times with it crashing out, rebooting, and actually forcing me back to DX11, which is the preferred path to take. Flipping over to DX11, as you can see here, we see a significant improvement on performance, but more importantly, we see much more consistency on those frame delivery times. Much closer to what we see on consoles, in fact never exceeding 50 milliseconds here on those tests, on the same settings, on the same visual quality, on the same resolution. So there's no issues here if you want to run DX11. It does run very well. With a few tweaks here, I'm sure we could get to a locked 60 FPS at 4K on this particular card, and it outperforms what we're seeing on other machines, but I didn't really have time to test at that level. But it's certainly a beautiful looking game, and obviously the PC version here is the sharpest of the lot due to the increase in resolution and therefore the tweaks you can make to the image quality overall. I'm looking forward to testing this in more detail and what those RTX features actually deliver. But moving into the other consoles, what do we see? Well, let's take a look at the base versions first, that PS4 and Xbox One versions, and like I say, they don't perform as well as hoped. As it stands in like-for-like tests, you can see here the PS4 can be around 40 to 55% faster than the One console over close gameplay or real-time cutscene moments. The Microsoft console rarely strays outside of the 30Hz level for prolonged periods, and as such, the controller response and visual update is the most inconsistent. It's much worse than what we saw in Resident Evil 7, but again the game is doing a lot more here. At the very least, based on this demo code, an option to cap the frame rate to 33 milliseconds limit, and as such 30 FPS is what is obviously needed. A fixed cap may be better, but some moments do suggest it may introduce bad frame pacing issues if it was introduced. Again though, this is an old build, so I suspect either a cap is introduced in the final release or significant improvements are made to draw it closer to the PS4 level, which itself is far from a locked 60, but it does introduce a higher consistency with my real-time frame rate average here showing you the clear benefit between the two. You can check out all the stats and details in the description below and the pinned comment. Again though, I feel an option is the best choice here, so those that prefer higher averages can keep this active, while a locked 30 is just a menu switch away. I am impressed that such a visually splendid game with so many effects and elements runs this well. The RE engine is quickly becoming one of my favourites when wielded by the talent clearly present at Capcom. If you look at the image here though, you can see the game itself struggles to keep 60 FPS in action. Both titles can drop down to the 40s, and the Xbox One never hits 60, in fact at any point during these tested moments. There might be points in the game when you're looking around in quieter sections it can hit 60, but really, as you can see here, it's very far removed from a locked 60 and really isn't a 60 FPS title at all. The PS4 is much better and more consistent, and it does perform and outperform the Xbox One here, but it really isn't as good or as close to that 60 FPS lock that Resident Evil 7 delivered. But again, this is early code, so we may see improvements on both consoles nearer launch. Obviously the premium consoles push this further. We've covered the visual quality, and performance is another and probably the biggest benefit thus far. We see very close to a locked 60 in action on the Xbox One X, even if it's running a slightly higher resolution overall natively, but we do see some dips on the PS4 Pro, never massive, and certainly this is a 60 FPS title here even at these high resolutions, but there are points in some of the light sections with your torched guns, dismemberment and gore It can dip down to those 33 milliseconds with some regularity at points, giving us an average in the low 50s, but really it's the 33 millisecond that is important and it keeps those close, so I do hold a lot of hope that maybe they can improve this in the final release. The Xbox One is brilliant during gameplay. In fact, it holds on to that pretty much locked all the time. There's a couple of dropped frames, but nothing really to worry about. It does flip on its head though once we get into real-time cutscenes, or at least the ones tested here. We see the Xbox One X really repeating what we've just seen in gameplay on the PS4 Pro, and it drops down to those 33 milliseconds quite often, again with an average in the low 50s. The PS4 holds on to these much better. It does dip, it does have a few judders, so it's certainly not a clean run in cutscenes, but it does appear to perform better due to maybe that slightly lighter load on the rendering resolution and the reduction in bandwidth that the Pro has. So you pick your poison essentially. Do you prefer cutscenes or gameplay? I know my choice would be gameplay, so the Xbox One does perform better during these sections at this point, and the Xbox One does perform worse during those cutscenes. It's a very close title, and the averages here tell you how close they get, taking all those things into account, but it's a very consistent title overall in this early look, and it absolutely delivers on all the promises of a classic remake of probably one of the best horror games ever made. I am looking forward to diving into this in much more detail across all versions, as I did with Resident Evil 7, so please check back around launch for that, and hopefully it'll be something you guys and girls will enjoy. Anyway, this is a great look at a great title, and even though 30 minutes is nowhere near enough, I will be back with much more Resident Evil horror, and I hope you guys and girls enjoyed this. If you did, please like, subscribe and share where appropriate, and I will catch you on the next one.
You bastard.